Ladies and gentlemen of the media, let me add my own special word of welcome to you, and especially to those of you who have traveled from afar. We really appreciate the effort you have made to be with us here this morning. We hope that at the end of it all, you will think that it would have been worth it. We certainly enjoyed the engagement last year, and that is why we have chosen to retain the similar format. Ladies and gentlemen, Caribbean economies and Caribbean society in general have always been characterized by vulnerability to external economic shocks and to myriad natural hazards. Our capacity to withstand these risks, which retard our growth and development, is always relatively limited. Perhaps at no time in our modern history has the region's progress been so threatened by a range of different challenges, both internal and external. The opportunity which we have today is to face these challenges head-on and to build a more resilient Caribbean. That's the optimism. We believe that the Caribbean Development Bank and our development partners have an important role to play in supporting our Caribbean to manage our risks better and to reduce the vulnerability, which is an inescapable part of our reality living here in the Caribbean. It is for this reason, ladies and gentlemen, that we have anchored our discussion of the performance of CDB and of the Caribbean economies around the theme, safeguarding the future, reducing vulnerability, and building resilience. We have also chosen to update you on the progress we have been making in helping our borrowing member countries to confront the most threatening and challenging of our vulnerabilities, that is, natural hazards and climate change. The presentation this morning is going to be in three different but related segments. I'm a little reluctant to present the roadmap in that manner because we really hope that we'll be able to integrate the three sections so that you see a recurring theme throughout the presentation. But there you have it. So we're going to start with a look at CDB's performance. For those of you who have come here expecting to hear about downgrades, you're going to be very disappointed. I think we have what the Americans say, we have doubled down on downgrades last year, and we're looking forward. We do not anticipate, we certainly do not plan to be facing any further downgrades. But what we want to talk about initially is how we have performed operationally. Because we think that by presenting that discussion, we have an opportunity to engage in a discussion about vulnerability, the relationship of CDB to that vulnerability, and the vulnerability in our own countries. You'll see on the slide on the screen that operationally, our approvals in 2012 were pretty much flat compared to 2011. That is approvals generally. When I talk about generally, I mean loans and grants, which are two main products that the Caribbean Development Bank offers to its member countries. If you separate out loans from grants, what has happened is that loan approvals actually declined by 28%. That decline, however, was offset by a steep increase in grants. But I should make the point that the increase in grants was largely due to the commitment of approximately $43 million to our Basic Needs Trust Fund program. What we do is we commit the entire block of resources up front. So that was, to some degree, a little bit of an aberration. If we look at the other side of the slide, where it speaks to disbursements, you will see that a similar pattern obtains. Our disbursements declined by 49%. I believe that what is happening there, or what happened, was that in the earlier years, we very aggressively pushed policy-based loans. And those tend to be very fast disbursing. So that what you would have found is that pretty much after 3 years, you would have disbursed all of the policy-based loans that had been approved earlier. So you're seeing there something of a dip. But what does this performance portray for us? The message it certainly sends to us is that we cannot differentiate our performance from the performance of our own borrowing members. And therein lies a segment of our own vulnerability. As goes our region, so goes the Caribbean Development Bank, which is why it behoves us to maintain a very close working relationship with these countries such that we make them more resilient so that the Caribbean Development Bank can be more resilient. But let me go to the next slide, because what I want to do here now is to become a little more granular. I want us to drill down to the loan approvals themselves, looking at it from the standpoint of who got the approvals and to which sectors they went. That's the first thing I want to do on this slide. Of note is that 65% of total approvals in 2012 went to three countries, Guyana, Jamaica, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. 26% of approvals went to Dominica, St. Lucia, Belize, and Barbados. So when you combine those two groups, what it says is that 91% of our approvals in 2012 were targeted at only 7 countries. The picture is not dissimilar when we look at it from the standpoint of sectors. Where did the resources go? To which sectors within the countries that I have described? First of all, there were 6 sectors which accounted for 97% of all approvals. 6 sectors got 97% of our approvals. 53% of the resources went to what we could broadly describe as road rehabilitation and upgrade. The education sector, which is one that we have been emphasizing in recent times, got 21% of the approvals. Disaster rehab and emergency relief received 11%, and a number of other diverse sectors received the remainder of the resources. What is this telling us in relation to vulnerability and risk? You'll recall, I said I wasn't going to talk about downgrades, but we have to reflect back on it. The discussion with the rating agencies last year centered around this issue of concentration risk. We argued that there is an inherent tendency in institutions like CDB for concentration, because we're not in the business of just making money. So we don't go after the countries necessarily with the best credit. What our mandate is, what our franchise value is to assist those countries who are in the greatest need. So that it is inevitable that you're going to get some kind of a concentration around those countries. And that is in fact what you're seeing here, using the approvals experience in 2012 just as a sample. I assure you it's not dramatically different over time. So, bottom line, the bank's performance reflects the difficult macroeconomic and fiscal environment in the regional and the international economy, which now allows me to segue into the situation with respect to the global economy in 2012. From the slide, you can see what we have done is we have tried to classify the countries into different groups. So we have global performance overall. What that tells us is that global performance actually softened in 2012 relative to 2011. And then if you break out that global group into advanced economies, you'll see that in 2011, the advanced economies grew by 1.6%. They grew marginally less by 1.3% in 2012. The US performance, I think we're pretty much familiar with that. Towards the latter part of the year, there was some improvement, even though that growth and recovery was undermined to some extent by the uncertainty surrounding issues relating to the fiscal cliff. Let us focus a little bit on those two groupings in Europe, UK and EU. You will notice that whilst they had very marginal growth in 2011, they actually went into negative territory in 2012. That's not good news for us, but we'll return to that anon. Then we look at the emerging economy category, and we see the robust growth. 6.3% in 2011, 5.1% in 2012. China is the stellar performer in 2011 and yet again in 2012. Similarly, India and a little bit more muted, but still impressive performance from the Latin America and Caribbean group. Unfortunately, they group the Caribbean into LAC. But the size of the economies would suggest that that's pretty much dominated by the Latin American group. Bottom line, you had a mixed picture. It was what they refer to sometimes as the two-speed growth phenomenon that's taking place in the world. The advanced economies not doing so well, struggling along, in fact, getting a little bit more problematic in Europe, but good, strong, robust growth taking place in the eastern part of the world, the so-called South economies. What about the Caribbean? What happened in our part of the world, in our neck of the woods? On average, output growth slipped to 1% compared to 1.2% a year earlier. This is not inconsistent with what most of the pundits anticipated earlier on. Maybe not the decline, but the decline was marginal nevertheless. At least 11 of our borrowing member countries saw some growth in 2012. The best performers, as we indicated last year, I believe, were Belize and Guyana. They had the highest rates of growth. And Haiti continued to enjoy growth as they pursue the recovery of their economy following the earthquake. 6 of our countries actually experienced declines in economic activity. These included Anguilla, Dominica, Grenada, St. Lucia, Montserrat, and Jamaica. Bottom line here, in general, the commodity-driven economies who are less dependent on the advanced countries perform better than the service-based borrowing member countries. The service-driven economies are interlocked with the advanced economies which performed poorly. Again, what this demonstrates is the vulnerability to slow recovery of those countries that are tied into those economies that are growing slowly. To just underscore the point about vulnerability in our economic performance, let's look at the tourism sector. Because as it's no surprise to you that many of our Caribbean countries are dominated by tourism in their trading activity and as a major driver of economic progress. Most of our borrowing member countries showed some improvement, although for several of them it was at a slower pace than in 2011. So that again mirrors the slower performance both in the countries into which they are connected by trade, but also it mirrors the slower growth in the economies themselves, the Caribbean economies. What are some of the factors that impacted tourism? In some of the Eastern Caribbean destinations, reduced airlift was a problem, both out of Europe and also out of North America. The UK market was another major factor. As those of you who are living here in Barbados will be aware, Barbados is a very special market for the United Kingdom. And what you're having there is a combination, I suspect, of difficult economic circumstances in the UK itself, combined with the air passenger duty tariff that has been imposed, which has been such a problem for many Caribbean economies. Let us look at what happened in some of the other major economic sectors to see if we can discern a different pattern. We have some scatter diagrams here. They're not the most impressive, but we'll see what we can do with them. We start with agriculture. Again, performance in agriculture, we really see only Belize and St. Lucia and Grenada with performance worth mentioning. The rest were either in the very, very low growth zone or not at all, or negative. So that, what was it that led to growth in these countries that experienced growth? Mainly positive weather factors, which points to another area of vulnerability in our economies, which is the heavy dependence on weather patterns for good performance in the agricultural sector. So for those economies that are very heavily dependent on agriculture, you have a bad summer, which is usually when the rainy season comes, and you end up with a difficult performance in the agricultural sector, which often has an impact on food prices. The construction sector, again, it's Belize and to a lesser degree Haiti. Only 2 countries really saw any kind of growth in the construction sector. Mining performance, no better news. Only Guyana. In respect of Jamaica, what is at work there is the continuing problem of not being able to address the matter of fuel. Jamaica's bauxite alumina industry relies almost completely on fossil fuels, which are very expensively priced, so that there's a competitive issue there. Guyana, the growth can be attributed to heavy demand for gold and bauxite alumina, and the prices, the high international prices that relate to those. Before I move on to a discussion of the prognosis for 2013, let me spend a little time on the fiscal indicators, fiscal and debt indicators. I think that graph kind of tells the story very, very eloquently. The Caribbean is a zone of very heavily indebted countries. If you look at the fiscal deficits, there has been some improvement, that's the good news. There has been some improvement in the overall deficit position of our countries, comparing 2012 with 2011. Antigua and Barbuda and St. Kitts and Nevis have made good progress in their IMF programs, their adjustment programs. But the issue of debt remains a pressing concern for many Caribbean countries. If we are not able to wrap our heads around the debt issue and come up with solutions, it is going to remain a drag on economic growth, and it is going to remain a source of major vulnerability. It is like our own households. If we are living every month from paycheck to paycheck, we have no reserves. Some external economic factor impacts us. We don't have the ability to tide ourselves over because we have no reserves. And that is the position that many of our countries find themselves in. Hence, they resort to going to the markets to borrow in order to pay for the recovery from natural disasters and things of that nature. What of 2013? Is there any basis for optimism? Well, cautious optimism. We expect some growth, but there are a lot of risks that remain. The US rebound is expected to continue to be fragile. All the prognoses that I have seen suggest that unemployment is going to remain high, unacceptably high, and therefore that will remain a drag on economic growth in the United States. Europe, the problems there are even more challenging. What we're facing there are the need for fundamental structural changes and the right policy mix to address fiscal consolidation, unsustainable public debt levels, banking sector instability, the low growth trap, and rising unemployment. Where are we expecting growth to come from in the world economy in 2013? Well, not surprisingly, developing Asia. In particular, China, which is projected to grow at 8.2%, and India at almost 6%. Latin America, closer to our neighborhood, is mostly Brazil, where targeted fiscal spending and ongoing monetary policy accommodation will spur growth of 3.5%. That's the estimate. What does that mean for the Caribbean countries? Recognizing that inextricable linkage between us as small nations and our need to be integrated into the international trading system. We have 4 different buckets there. It's not difficult to discern where the preponderance of the outcomes are expected. It's in that less than 2% bucket. We have there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 countries. 10 of our 18 Caribbean countries are in that bucket. I think I counted correctly. So that's a good chunk of our membership. And not surprisingly, a number of those countries are the ones that CDB lends to. Hence, the integration of the risk in the countries with the risk in CDB. We expect Guyana to lead the growth based on stepped-up public sector investment and gains in agriculture. There's also a lot that's happening with foreign direct investment in the Guyanese economy. Haiti, we expect to register strong growth on account of the reconstruction efforts and gains in manufacturing and agriculture. The OECS, the main challenge there is fiscal consolidation, but we're still anticipating growth of between 1 and 2%. Jamaica, the jury is still out. The agreement with the IMF is still under negotiation. Great uncertainty surrounding that outcome, and therefore it's difficult to project what is going to happen there. Barbados, we're expecting marginal growth, somewhere just around 1% or a little bit below. And Grenada, the prospects there will depend on the outcome of negotiations with the IMF for a possible new agreement. Bottom line, same old, more of the same. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you have heard it before. We repeat it here today. The Caribbean economies need to adjust. They need to adjust their fiscal, they need to address debt, but they also need to get economic growth. The debt to GDP ratio that is frequently used as an indicator of level of indebtedness is a ratio. It's debt as the numerator, GDP as the denominator. Any capacity to grow the denominator will bring that ratio down and will have very positive impacts on the prospects of those countries. I think that the studies clearly demonstrate that there is a very strong nexus between reduction in poverty and economic growth. Not that economic growth in and of itself is sufficient, but it's a necessary condition. What are some of the things that need to be done? Well, we have alluded to them earlier. The concentration of many of our Caribbean countries into the advanced economies of North America and Europe represent continuing risk for us. If they do not find the mechanisms, the wherewithal, to be able to spread that risk, what's the old saying? Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Well, that's the conundrum that many of our countries face. The markets that they are in are very much the ones that are in difficulties. They need to find the wherewithal to begin to trade more with the countries, the economies that are growing. We have spoken about them. You're talking more here about the old mantra of South-South cooperation. But there's work to be done domestically also. There's a lot of work to be done in improving the efficiency of government operations. Why is this important? The extent to which government impacts on business affects the cost of doing business. It leads to what is referred to in the trade as transactions costs. If the government causes business to have to spend more money than they should in order to get goods and services, it leads to inefficiency in private sector operations. The third bullet on this slide uses a fancy economic term, marginal efficiency of investment. All that is saying really is that the dollar that you spend in investment must have a good return on that investment. Otherwise, what ends up happening is capital expenditure that does not have a good return on investment only leads to the immiseration of the country, increases its poverty. We suspect, and I think the evidence is there to support the view, that this is part of the debt accumulation problem that many of our Caribbean countries have experienced. In respect of the response to the need for growth, next slide, please. The Caribbean Development Bank recognizes that it is easy to talk about growth. It is much more difficult to achieve growth. There are so many factors that are involved. As I think we explained last year, one of the initiatives that we have chosen to associate ourselves with is what is called the Caribbean Growth Forum. This is an initiative that brings together several different Caribbean countries. It was launched at the University of the West Indies last year in Jamaica. And a number of fora have been held in different countries since that time. What the Caribbean Growth Forum does is it opens up the dialogue around what are the constraints to growth, what are some of the things that need to be done to achieve growth. That growth discussion in the past has tended to be restricted to a very elite group. The view now is, and we share that view, is that we need to broaden the conversation. So, one of the things that the Caribbean Growth Forum is doing is to incorporate, for example, the youth. The youth need to be at the table. They're one of the social groups that are most adversely impacted by no growth. You look at all of the statistics on unemployment in this region. You will see that the highest component of that, those statistics is related to the youth. So the youth have to be at the table. And for me, the youth represent an important dynamic in transforming and recovering Caribbean economies. They're the ones who have the technological aptitude. They're the ones who have the creative ability. They're the ones who can create new industries for us. But we need to have them at the table, engaged, so that we can hear what are their constraints, what are their aspirations. The CART Fund is another initiative we spoke about last year, and CDB is collaborating with DFID. I think CEDA is also involved, and the implementing agency is the IDB. CDB's role in this is to allow access to the OECS countries which are not themselves members of the Inter-American Development Bank. The third initiative, Compete Caribbean, is one that I'm sure you know about. But I mention it because it speaks to this trade issue and trade access. If we are not able to create the capacity in countries to facilitate exports, and if we don't enable our manufacturing and service enterprises to position themselves such that they can be internationally competitive, we'll be here every year talking about the need for economic growth. It just needs to happen. And this Compete Caribbean, it's a relatively small amount of money, but the return on the investment can be significant. We are also having discussions with other donors about the possibility of doing an encore on something not dissimilar to Compete Caribbean, because we believe in its importance and its relevance to galvanizing economic growth. The final point on the growth story is one that we're going to get into in a little bit more depth as I come to the last part of our presentation, that is climate adaptation and building resilience. Now, ladies and gentlemen, for some time now, CDB has been gradually building its own capacity in relation to disaster risk reduction and also climate change. We have been working in the business of environment for a very long time. That has been mainstreamed across CDB's operational work. In recent times, climate change has become one of the factors in our shop window. In 2011, we made a pledge to our governors that we were going to become a player in the climate change business. But we also said at that time that you cannot be a player effectively if you don't have access to resources, because climate change, a climate change response, an effective one, requires that you intervene in a particular manner, and that requires resources. Why is it that we need to be involved in this business? Our region has a high natural hazard and climate risk vulnerability. That is the nature of the neighborhood that we live in. It's a factor of geography. And it will only be exacerbated by climate change, climate variability, and sea level rise, as we observe the increasing frequency and loss, damage, and dislocation that's associated with hurricanes, tropical storms, and floods. One of the features also of our economies is the heavy dependence on imported fossil fuels. The Caribbean is not a big emitter of gases to the environment, one of the factors in climate change. But we certainly suffer from the fact that we are very heavily exposed to fossil fuels. What does it do? The impact is that we have, given the prices of fossil fuels relative to other fuels, it affects the competitiveness of Caribbean industry and our place in the international economy. So that there is an imperative to try to shift as much as is possible our production base away from fossil fuels towards renewables. One of the incentives for doing so is that as climate resources become available, they can also be used to finance these kinds of transformations away from fossil fuels to renewable sources. One of the problems we have here in the Caribbean as it relates to climate change is we have weak capacity in countries. CDB is trying to build the capacity within its own institution, but we also recognize that we cannot be effective if in the countries that we are relating to, they do not themselves have capacity. So that part of our mandate is to provide resources and assistance to those countries, those institutions and countries that are moving towards addressing climate risks. Just to provide some context, as I indicated, we have very high vulnerability to climate impacts. Projected economic losses are 5% of GDP by 2025 and 10% of GDP by 2050. Very early on, our Caribbean countries, our CARICOM heads in particular, decided to take a regional approach to this matter. We're all in the same boat. Very few Caribbean countries do not suffer from the impacts of climate change. So that the view was that it was necessary to approach this thing as a group. This led to the creation of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, or 5 Cs as it's affectionately called. This institution is located in Belize. This is an institution that's built more around the science of climate change. And our heads of government also adopted a regional climate change strategy as far back as 2009. And they also rolled out a regional implementation plan in 2011. In order to build climate resilience, what CDB has been doing is, as I indicated, we have been building our own internal capacity, and we have been providing assistance to regional institutions such as the 5 Cs, also to CIMH, and to CDEMA, the Regional Disaster Response Agency. But let's get to the real issue here, money and finance. Resource mobilization is where the rubber really hits the road. If we can't mobilize those resources, we're not going to be a player. So how have we chosen to go about that? We have been positioning our institution as a regional financial intermediary for international climate finance, as well as an executing agency. In other words, those people who have money, who want to carry out climate adaptation initiatives, can work through the Caribbean Development Bank using our capacity. What is the strategy that we are pursuing? One of the strategies that we are pursuing is to bring within our own institution expertise that can help us to navigate through this, I don't want to use the word morass because I might upset my colleagues over here on the left, but it's kind of like a maze out there of available sources of climate finance. Some of it is bilateral, some of it is multilateral, some of it is a combination of the two. The trick is, how do you get your hands on those resources? One thing that we have done is we have hired Mr. Selwyn Hart over here to my right. You can raise your hand, Selwyn. I'm pointing him out because I'm also putting him on the spot. He's going to be performance driven. If he doesn't bring in the resources, he doesn't have a job. So Selwyn is under some heat. But we know he can deliver, that's why we hired him. But seriously, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't understand the architecture out there, that climate finance architecture, you're not going to be successful in getting any of that money, any significant amount of that money. And that is why Selwyn is so important to us, because he doesn't come here as a neophyte. He's not coming here to learn on the job. He has been out there in that morass that I talked about. He understands it. There are several different sources of those funds. Next slide. These are, no, sorry. Back up. Yeah, these are some of the sources of funding. I don't want to get into them in any detail, but that's just a sampling of the number of funds that are out there, sources of financing. We have to be able to get our hands on them. Next slide. What is it that CDB has done up to this point in terms of mobilizing some of these resources? We mentioned last year that we had been in discussions with the European Investment Bank and that we had concluded a climate action line of credit equivalent to about 50 million euros, 65 million US or thereabouts. This was the first, I think this was the first real source of financing along these lines that we were able to secure. We are in the process now of working with the European Investment Bank to put us in a position where we can start to commit these resources. It is my expectation that these funds will start to be committed during the course of this year. There was a learning process that we and the EIB had to go through in order to put us in a place where we could start to commit the resources. We've also been able to get through our Canadian and British partners what is referred to as the Community Disaster Risk Reduction Fund. This is going to be focusing on disaster risk reduction at the community level, which is an important place to put that activity. We have a point person in the bank on it now, and we are also going to be getting additional resources joining that effort so that we can really make this thing happen. CDB has also made a contribution from its own resources of about $750 million US. In an effort to build our own internal capacity to manage climate risks, we have been training staff in new methodologies, the development of guidance tools and other resources, and the design of new instruments for supporting our borrowing members in their risk reduction efforts. The strategy is not only are we going to garner our own resources, but we're going to work with others. That is a great way of leveraging our resources. Pool them with others, benefit from their technical experience, but also benefit from their finances. That is what we're going to do. And we have started to build and strengthen these relationships with a number of players. And some of them are listed on the slide in front of you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this brings me to my closing remarks. How does CDB's climate change initiative dovetail with the region's economic prospects? Adaptation projects typically have a strong infrastructure component. These hold out the prospect of employment generation and economic stimulus. The drive to introduce greater reliance on renewable energy and improved energy efficiency can lay the basis for transforming our economies and placing them on a more competitive and sustainable trajectory. The anticipated favorable financing terms for climate resources will facilitate economic transformation without exacerbating fiscal deficits and national indebtedness. This is how CDB's initiatives in the area of climate change will contribute to enhancing resilience and creating the basis for sustainable economic growth. I thank you very much.